Heman Marion Sweatt was a mail carrier from Houston who was African American and who ended up becoming the first African American to apply for admissions at the University of Texas Law School. That was back in 1946, and he was rejected according to the law for no other reason than because he was an African American. Thurgood Marshall, at the time of the Sweatt application, was the General Counsel of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he was at the forefront of the NAACP's litigation efforts, which ultimately led to the end of enforced legal racial segregation in America. Heman Marion Sweatt's case in Texas was chosen as a frontrunner for the NAACP's efforts for a number of reasons. Number one, Texas had made itself rather vulnerable insofar as it provided no professional school opportunities for African Americans in the 1940s. So not only was Texas in a situation where it was separate and unequal, it was separate and non-existent. So Thurgood Marshall and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People chose that case because it was such a clear-cut violation not only of the equal rights portions of our United States Constitution, but it was also a violation of the separate but equal doctrine enunciated by Plessy, because there was nothing to be equal to. African Americans had no opportunities. And so Sweatt became an ideal case. The Sweatt versus Painter case is probably the single most unsung case in the history of civil rights, insofar as it was ruled upon by the Supreme Court in 1950, only 4 years before Brown. It's significant because it made the Brown case possible. While Brown versus Board of Education made segregation explicitly unconstitutional, it was the Sweatt case that made it implicitly unconstitutional. The Supreme Court effectively invalidated the separate but equal doctrine in Sweatt when it set a definition of equality that was impossible to achieve. And so in Brown, in my book Before Brown, I argue that from a legal standpoint, segregation became impossible. The case Sweatt versus Painter is still cited today in many civil rights cases, but especially the affirmative action cases of our time. In the Bakke case in the 1970s in California, Sweatt was used to illustrate a number of things, including the educational value of diversity. In the Grutter case in Michigan in 2003, Sweatt was also cited as an example of efforts to prepare future leaders from all segments of society. Justice O'Connor in the Michigan affirmative action case cited the Sweatt case as an example of why the doors of higher education need to be visibly open to all segments of our society. After the Sweatt versus Painter case was ruled upon in 1950, Heman Sweatt came to the University of Texas Law School and enrolled in September of 1950. He was a student for about a year to a year and a half, and because of academic problems, he dropped out of school and later moved to Atlanta, where he earned a master's degree from Atlanta University, and he lived in Atlanta until his death in 1982. Thurgood Marshall went on to adjudicate the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, only 4 years after the Sweatt case, and from there he became the first African American to ever be appointed an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He was appointed by a Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson.